Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the final part of this selection of shows, which have mostly been about armored warfare in kind of various aspects. This one, I warn you now, those of you who play the World War II TV drinking game, the word rabbit hole will probably come up quite a lot. So have a bonus drink right now because we just had a 5-10 minute chat there and there's so many potential rabbit holes with this one. How far do you go in the pre-Falaise gap, Mortan, Lutich, Operation Spring, Atlantic, Goodwood. So there's potential rabbit holes to trip us up. But what we're doing today is essentially discussing the German reaction to the Allied invasion. John Buckley took us through how the British and Canadians adapted and improved their tank doctrine and how they got their tactics better. And today we're looking at the German side of things. Now, my guest, Anthony Tucker-Jones, is a prolific author, and the book we're focusing on today is this book, Falaise, The Flawed Victory, which you can buy at all your local bookshops, and there's a link to get it in there. And I'm going to bring him in a minute, and he's got a new book out this week, this recently, which we're going to talk about as well. If you're new to World War II TV, don't forget to click subscribe. Don't forget to share what we're doing on social media, and all the information you need is in the pull down menu there. And I think there are a few new people with us today because of the show with Sophie Line yesterday. So if you've come to us because of Sophie Line's appearance, hello and welcome to the show, and that's great, and we're glad to have you. So today we're looking at the German reaction to the Allied invasion leading to the Falaise Gap area. So this is that battles that had just concluded 78 years ago this week as the Germans were finally falling back the Seine River. So I'm going to bring in Anthony Tucker-Jones. So good evening, Anthony. How are you today?
Hi, Paul. Very well, thank you. Enjoying the sunshine here, actually. It's
lovely. So you have, you're a prolific author, but you've got a new book out about the Waffen-SS. So before we dive into the Falaise Gap, just share with us what this one's about.
Yes, I've just, if I can get that on camera, there you go. Don't know how good the picture is there. This very briefly, basically just looks at the combat performance of Waffen-SS divisions. I, like a lot of people, are quite fascinated by what constituted the Waffen-SS, what were the premier divisions, what were the chronically bad ones. It also looks at the European volunteer units, volunteer divisions, which of course actually some of them proved to be very, very good. And it also quite rightly touches on SS war crimes committed by the Waffen-SS divisions, which are well catalogued. So that's it really in a nutshell.
Well, brilliant. And as we always say, it's important. You cannot detach the military aspect from the atrocity aspect. If you're tackling these units, they come together as a package, I think. And the books that just kind of not glorify, but the ones all in with the black and silver covers that are full of just pictures of Panzers, and they never mention the dark side of it. They annoy me a bit.
No, that was when I was writing it. That was one thing that quite a few people said to me. This isn't just going to be glossing over how brilliant they were as fighters, and that won't just be the sole focus, will it? You're going to look at the Malmedy massacres, what they did in 1940, what they did on the Eastern Front, all those sorts of things. So it does kind of cover all aspects of them. Also covers how they were recruited, how they were raised, how they were trained. It's designed as a good primer. Hopefully, if you're familiar with the Waffen-SS, you'll find it interesting. If you're new to that subject, then hopefully people will find it a good introduction. It tries to tickle the bases, I think. I say I thoroughly enjoyed writing it. And I say the main thing for me was at the end, it was to conclude actually that the Waffen-SS, like the rest of the SS, were culpable. The Nuremberg World Trials at the end, it was deemed that they were part of that overall apparatus and therefore couldn't be separated from, the Einsatzgruppen and all those. The concentration camp guards and all the rest of it, that in fact they were all part and parcel of the same overall organization, obviously overseen by Himmler, and therefore were culpable, which I think, I had no argument.
You can't say that enough, can we? It's
no. And again, we're digressing slightly, but it's like things with the, a lot of the divisions actually recruited and rotated in and out prison guard regiments. So, they had blood on their hands one way or another.
Absolutely. Well, talking of units with blood on their hands, it's going to come up in the conversation today because we're talking about the Panzergruppe and the divisions, and some of them are SS, but we're not going to focus on that. But we mentioned your book there, and it is a great read. I reread it again, and of course, it's already come up in the sidebar about the title, the Flawed Victory, and of course, we all know the game with publishing. It's getting that title that brings people in, but clearly, whether or not the victory was as complete as it could have been is something that is always debated. The performance of the British, the Canadians, the Poles, the Americans has been hotly debated and will continue to be so. But what I think is always overlooked, and it's what we're going to focus on today, is what the Germans are doing. Because I'm going to put it to you that a lot of us tour guides and others, we kind of often we talk about the Falaise Gap as the German units pulling out in complete disarray and disorganization and just, panic and when you delve into it at a greater level, as you do in your book, there is a little bit of that, but there's also quite a lot of very, very organized, defensive positions, rear guard actions that are desperately trying to keep the gap open. But I realize we're skipping ahead of ourselves. Let's get back to the organization the Germans kind of pick up from where John Buckley left it a couple of days ago. The German the armored units, they're not mostly there on June the 6th. They're arriving as the weeks pass. But what was their single did they have a single reaction to what they were going to do about it? What was their focus on it in terms of trying to resist and delay and halt the Normandy invasion?
I think that for the Normandy campaign, that's always one of the things that thoroughly fascinated me, was that dilemma the Germans had on, how are we going to react? What are we going to do? And that kind of is the focus of the book. The book actually takes the reader through what happened to the dozen or so armored divisions individually, but also brings it all together, obviously, in the introduction and the conclusion. But once Rommel had been appointed, commander for the Normandy defences, he then had that dilemma of what did he do with his armored divisions. Of course, Rommel was very much a armored commander, believed in the mobility of war, conducted a thoroughly mobile campaign in North Africa. But the thing that he understood very well from his experiences in North Africa was the power of Allied aircraft, the Allied air power. And he appreciated that actually it was much better to have your troops up at the front ready to go than keep them back and then bring them forward where they would be subject to airstrikes. So the Germans essentially for Normandy had this sort of shield and sword dilemma, was that would they bring the armor forward and then have the infantry behind them to reinforce them, or would they do it around the other way, that the infantry would form the shield and the panzers would be held back to be the sword to counterattack when the invasion started. And this was an argument that they never ever resolved. In fact, they sort of fudged it because they had some units came directly under Rommel, reserves that were answerable to Hitler. They could only be released with Hitler's authority. And then they also set up this command structure, something called Panzergruppe West, under the command of a general called General Schweppenberg, who seems to have vanished, from history pretty much. But his job was, once the invasion started, Panzergruppe West would become this live command and control organization, and would take charge of, marshalling the panzer divisions for a massed iron fist counterattack, if you like. So they never ever resolved quite satisfactorily what was going where. So Rommel ended up with a few panzer divisions within hailing distance, most memorably 21st Panzer, obviously, because they counterattacked on the day of D-Day. But he also ended up with other units much further back that were too far away, really, to have any impact on the day itself. And also with Panzergruppe West, because of all the radio traffic it was generating, the Allies knew where the headquarters was, so pounced on it fairly sharply. So took that out quite quickly as well, which again sort of hampered, the German response. And also, of course, famously, on the day of D-Day, no one would wake up Hitler and ask him to release those reserve units. So again, that caused much delay, which in a way, of course, helped the Allies get a foothold, with those bridgeheads from the 5 invasion beaches. It kind of gave them a bit of a breather, which let's face it, they certainly needed once they were ashore.
Yeah, so but then at the same time, sorry to interrupt you there, but at the same time, the the Allies didn't quite push in as much as they were hoping to. The beachhead wasn't quite as broad and deep as they wanted. So that gave the time for the Germans to kind of get themselves organized. And I realized, and anyone who's ever done a tour of the Falaise Gap, or people like David O'Keefe who's watching, has tried to write about it, it's always, where do you begin the story? Because do you go through everything that happened in June and July? And, we will have to kind of eventually skip up to kind of to the late July period. But through much of that June and July, it does get fairly static, particularly around the southern part of Caen, or the Hill 112, Borger Ridge, and things like that. And whether that kind of plays into the Allied hands or the Germans' hand is kind of depending on your point of view, because it's an attritional war. But it does allow the Germans to kind of get into their kind of defensive routine, and people like David O'Keefe have written about Atlantic and Spring, and Arthur Glaxon, and things like that. And then everything changes in July, because as Professor Buckley took us through, that you get all the Cobra and Bluecoat happen in quick succession, and suddenly everything's changed. So take us up to kind of the end, from the kind of middle part of July, the reaction to Goodwood, what starts changing for the Panzer units, and their role kind of shifts slightly, doesn't it?
Well, picking up your point about the battle became very static fairly quickly after 6th of June. The key thing to remember that was, of course, that the Allied deception operation was so successful. Hitler remained convinced that Normandy actually was a feint, and that the main attack would come across the Pas-de-Calais, because obviously it was the shortest route. And therefore, Hitler would not release the infantry divisions that came under 15th Army north of the Seine, which, of course, meant that where the panzer divisions were used to plug gaps in the German line, they couldn't be replaced by infantry because they simply didn't have them, which, of course, is what consigned what should have been a mobile fist to actually fighting a fairly static and attritional war. And it wasn't until Hitler decided actually that Normandy was it, that he began to release infantry divisions from 15th Army, and also, of course, began to send reinforcements from Army Group G in the south of France as well. So you had that long period where the Germans really were very restricted on the amount of counterattacking they could do. Most of it tended to be on a fairly tactical level. I mean, that's one of the great failings, that they never actually did, what you would call a strategic level, if you like, counterattack. I mean, the only one really that's probably worthy of that to a degree is the Mortain counterattack in early August. But basically, the Germans were treading water until such time as they could free up the panzer divisions from the front line, so they could refit them and then conduct, concerted counterattacks on the Allies. So for a long time, the Germans were kind of consigned to fighting, a non-mobile war simply to keep the Allied bridgehead contained. Obviously, they were given a certain degree of breathing space because the Americans needed to take Cherbourg, which meant they were fighting their way north rather than coming south. So that again greatly delayed the timetable for the Allies. And you're right, the British were supposed to have captured Bayeux and been happily on their way to Caen, by the end of D-Day, but again that didn't happen. But I think the thing that Rommel realised actually before the invasion took place was that the strategic ground for his panzers were just to the southeast of Caen, the Bourg Ridge. He knew that if he could hold the Allies there, that would prevent them getting out into better tank country, which obviously would then put them onto the road to Paris, which is why, again, of course, as we famously know, the bulk of the panzers were facing Montgomery and not Bradley's American units, because Rommel felt that Monty obviously was more of a threat. Of course, hindsight's a wonderful thing, and actually it turned out the Americans were a greater threat because they broke out with Cobra. But of course, the Americans had to get their ducks in a row first by taking Cherbourg, and it wasn't until that point that they could then turn south and consider, breaking out, at Avranches, and obviously heading into Brittany. But of course, once they'd done that, crucially with Cobra, that then enabled them to swing eastwards, and that's what starts off, if you like, the creation of the Falaise pocket, because the Germans, I think the German generals knew, even in the first week of August, once the Americans broken out, that launching a counterattack was a pointless exercise. Of course, the Allies were well warned about the Mortain counteroffensive because Ultra had picked up all their radio traffic, so they knew they were going to do it. The American Air Force and the RAF obviously intervened, and the whole thing came to a standstill. So after that failed to nip off the American breakout, then that withdrawal becomes paramount. I mean, there's nothing else that the Germans can do. So they start considering, escaping. Of course, in the meantime, the Brits and the Canadians are pushing south. And things get really interesting once, obviously, the Canadians break into Falaise. And then to the south, forgive my French pronunciation, but the Americans get to Argentan. To the south. But of course, the Americans took the decision there, once they got there, crucially, not to push north, because they were frightened about, well, not frightened, but worried about, yes, as the map shows, you can see Falaise there in the north and Argentan in the south. That would have been a good place to nip off that developing bulge with all the German forces trapped in it. But the Americans were wary of friendly fire, so decided actually the show would be run by Monty. So he began to push south. And the net result of that was, of course, actually the pocket was sealed or nipped off much further to the east between Trun and Chambois, which, of course, is the bit that becomes interesting. I think by the 19th, I think the gap's something like 15 miles wide, but it very, very quickly contracted until the point you've got, as we can see on this map, you've got between Trun and Chambois, you've basically got crossings at Saint-Lambert, Sedive, and also the ford, I think that's
Mossy, which is just south. Yeah,
Mossy, yes.
And I made this image for a show last year, and this is my Google Earth. So, we're talking about, and I'll tens of thousands of Germans now trying to get east through a gap that is getting smaller day by day. Someone said it was like trying to push a marshmallow into a money box. Someone described it to me once.
That's a good way of putting it.
And
yeah,
they lose the bridge at Tournai-sur-Dee very, very quickly. Chambois, despite the kind of the lack of inertia shown by the American 90th Division, if there's any Americans who are watching this who like the 90th Division, I do think they kind of slightly underperformed there. And the French 2nd Armored Division, who are nearby, they're being a bit. They've been distracted by the fact that Paris is now kind of on the horizon, so they're a bit of a secondary. But then these roads, though, I just want to point out the roads 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These are the only roads that are kind of running out of the forest down the bottom there, and they've got to get out of this gap. And it restricts eventually to just 0.7 of a mile between the bridge in Saint-Lambert, Sedive, and the ford at Mossy. But again, I want to get your reaction, Anthony, to the fact that when we talk about it, and I talk about Alexander Black's watching this, and Brad Sanquin and David O'Keefe, it's always about what the Americans are doing, what the Brits are doing, what the Poles are doing, what the Canadians are doing. And the Germans are often written about as just reacting. They're the kind of the stormtroopers in the Star Wars films. They're the nameless baddies in movies. And what we want to get today is the idea of how are they trying to keep this gap open from there? But what are they? How do they realize how precarious their position is? That's what I think is really key to this.
Yes, I think they certainly did. I mean, in a way, I'll invoke Max Hastings, because, of course, many years ago in 1984, he got himself in trouble by saying, well, the reasons that the Germans hung on so long and it took the Allies so long to actually defeat them was because they were better soldiers. And I think he's since sort of recanted on that because he was highly criticized. But the thing to remember, the Germans is that their the level of discipline, which they showed throughout the war, in fact, was quite remarkable. So I think although they were aware, you ended up with 20-odd divisions, which 7 of which were armored. It's about 100,000 men trapped in that pocket. Now you think that would turn into a shambles and chaos. And of course, post-war, for historians like you and I, we're influenced by the photographs that we saw of the Falaise pocket, of the fords, of the bridges, and the destruction wrought on the Germans. And that gives the impression, actually, that the whole thing inside the pocket was completely chaotic. And I think that was actually far from the case, is because the Germans that were assigned to hold the perimeter of the pocket pretty much stayed where they were and withdrew slowly. So they managed to keep the pocket intact. And then the units inside the pocket that were making for the exits, again, they did so in a very disciplined manner. The Germans were dab hand at putting together these, battle groups, camp groups of, bottle washers, cooks, pay clerks, and all the rest of it. And quite often, actually, to be fair, Panzer Grenadiers, regular infantry, and Panzertruppen. But even when they were in these ad hoc groups, they fought really well. So I think the Germans understood that if they were going to save their units and their divisions, then there had to be effectively an orderly withdrawal, even though, of course, the pocket's under heavy artillery fire. It's being attacked by fighter bombers, Typhoons, Mustangs, Thunderbolts. I mean, the place was not, it was not a pleasant place to be. But at no point does the German army collapse. And I think today you would expect a large body of men like that in that pocket to lose all coherence and probably surrender. But of course, the Germans didn't do that. What they did was they fought their way out. And indeed, of course, they also conducted counterattack operations to try and keep the mouth of the pocket open for a bit longer. Yes, and as David's flashing up there, David O'Keefe's flashing up, the Germans were good at thinking on their feet because of their experiences on the Eastern Front. That they, time and time again on the Eastern Front, they got themselves trapped in pockets, and time again they'd escaped. So in a way, for the Germans, the Falaise pocket wasn't anything new. They'd experienced this before. Obviously, it was a situation they certainly did not want to be in because it was a matter of life and death. But of course, it came as a shock, obviously, once they were kicked out of Saint-Lambert because they'd lost that bridge. I think the ford at Moissy is not great. And also, of course, we just discussed that the Allies were worried about friendly fire, but of course the Canadians very bravely stuck themselves basically in the entrance to the pocket, at Saint-Lambert. They're also on, I'm going from memory here, I think Hill 117, isn't it? Just to the north. And then just a bit further east, the Polish, First Armoured Div, they then sit on that ridge of hills to the north.
Yeah, they're on 262 north and east. Yeah, Hill 117 was Wotherspoon's artillery position that was keeping Curry's position in the town open. And there is the bridge there on the screen there, folks. And then the ford is kind of just down the road. There's a cluster of buildings around that. And if we can
go back to the photo, Paul, I mean, you can see how narrow that is. That's essentially a single vehicle width bridge. So if you're trying to get half tracks and panzers across it, when you're being shot at by Canadian Shermans and anti-tank guns, it's almost an impossible task. And again, with that sort of bridge, all you need is a single breakdown or a vehicle destroyed on it, and it's blocked. You might get across the river there. I mean, the banks are quite steep. If you gun it, you might get over it. But you can see how desperate it was for both the Germans and indeed the Canadians fighting over that crossing, because for the Germans, essentially that was their main way out. But of course, they were also facing, what was a labyrinth, if you like, because of those sort of overlapping defensive positions that the Poles and the Canadians had put in place. It meant even once they were through here, they were still being shelled by, Allied tanks, artillery, and being attacked by aircraft. But I'd say the remarkable thing is they didn't lose their coherence. And I think that's the key thing in that pocket, is that you didn't have units surrendering wholesale. It simply didn't happen. And I think the thing for me that reflected the level of discipline that was going on in there is they captured a single general. I can't remember his name now. Commander of 84th Corps, I think. They captured a single general in the area of the pocket just outside, I think. The Poles caught him, but they didn't get any of the others. We ended up with General von Choltitz, obviously in Paris, who's the commandant there. And a bit later, I think they ended up with General Eberbach, who was temporary commander of 7th Army. They caught him as well. But you didn't see wholesale surrenders going on in that pocket. So again, that sort of image that we have from the footage that we've seen in the photographs, subsequently kind of almost mislead us a bit as to what was going on and what was happening.
Definitely, because the photos are of the aftermath, and it's often sort of the rear of the columns and the bits that have been left at the back, where it is the horse-drawn wagons and the dregs and the soft skins and things and tanks that have been, broken down and now repaired. They're the ones that kind of end up in the photos, particularly. But I also think another bit that's been overlooked by a lot of historians are the Germans who've already got out, who are sitting at the other side of the Polish position and are doing their best to keep the pocket open, because within that body of men, there are some really able commanders who know exactly what they're doing. And as David O'Keefe said, they've dealt with this kind of situation before, of keeping pockets open and doing these, retreating, falling back maneuvers. So tell us a bit about the Germans who've already got out, who I just think so often just fall through the cracks.
Well, the thing to bear in mind, of course, with the Germans is that they're not all in the pocket either. That's the other thing. This pocket's formed, but essentially the boundary of the pocket is bandit country. So to the south, you've got the Americans, to the north, you've got the Brits, the Canadians and the Poles. But also still milling around there are large numbers of German units that have been cut off from their parent divisions, particularly in the south, all obviously heading east to get to the Seine and get over the river. Because the other thing, of course, is we do forget is that tends to be ignored with the history of the pocket and indeed the Normandy campaign, is while this is going on, the Germans actually prepared a very good rear guard at Rouen, north of Paris, to get over the river. Because the irony is the Germans actually, courtesy of the assistance that they were getting on the eastern side of the pocket mouth, managed to nurse quite a lot of equipment as far as the docks at Rouen. But couldn't get them over the river because all the bridges were down. So actually a lot of equipment was also lost there. So again, we have this image of all these knocked out tanks and lorries and, like say, horse-drawn stuff in the pocket. But there's also a huge amount of equipment dumped on the river simply because they had no way of getting them over. And we tend to forget that they actually successfully withdrew a lot. And I think the key thing to remember, of course, with the pocket and the defeat in general is overall, the Germans committed throughout the campaign around about 2,000 Panzers and assault guns. That's not including armored cars and self-propelled guns, of which they got away with just over 100. So it shows you how catastrophic that defeat is in Normandy. But at the same time, the Germans managed to get about 250,000 men out of France, which I think is probably including a fairly big lump from Army Group G in the south, because of course, come mid-August, when all this is going wrong for the Germans in Normandy, the Allies belatedly launched their second seaborne attack on France, down on the Riviera, which of course, complete waste of time because all the key units had already been drawn north to Normandy anyway, and the Germans proceeded to fight this similar withdrawal action from the south of France, and in fact ended up with a sort of mini Falaise pocket at Montelima, where 11th Panzer, held back the Americans while a big chunk of equipment and troops escaped. So, but I think the key thing with the pocket is they lost nearly all the physical equipment. But the thing that struck me from the Panzergruppe side of things is they committed about 160,000 troops with those half dozen or so, armored divisions, Panzer and Panzer Grenadier divisions. But nearly 100,000 of them got away. And that was why I called that book The Flawed Victory, because not one of those divisions caught in that pocket was written off. They were reconstituted and, of course, famously launched the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's Winter Ardennes offensive. So all those divisions in that pocket were saved. And I say, crucially, they ended up with a very large cadre of experienced Panzertruppen who, thanks to old, Albert Speer's weapons factories, churned out all the equipment that they needed, re-equipped them. As we know, Hitler fought this sort of, delaying rearguard action until the winters to try and keep those armored forces away from the front line so they'd be ready. So that shows you the level of discipline and organization that the Germans showed in actually getting out of that pocket. Because rightly, it's seen as the culmination of the Normandy campaign. The Allies had 2.5 months of really bitter fighting to get to that stage. So it is a well-deserved victory, conducted with reasonable flair. But the problem is, of course, the pocket was not shot off quick enough. It's 21st of August, I think they finally closed it. When the Poles met with the Americans at Chambois.
The Polish-American link-up was first, and the Poles and the Canadians linked up finally properly, I think on the 22nd. It was the Canadian Guards met up on the road from Montormel back towards Saint-Lambert, Sadiv. So 22nd, they count it as firmly closed. But as we can imagine, the sidebar is full of the conversations about, could David Curry have done more? Should they have bombed the bridge? Should this, as is always the case with the Falaise Gap, it's kind of the spreading of allocation of blame and responsibility, and But what I'm interested from your point of view, Anthony, is just what did the Germans do well in the pocket, and what did they do badly? Because run us through some of these really important kind of rear guard actions on the periphery of this pocket, because that some of these, as you said, these camping groups were doing some really quite effective stuff, holding off units for a day or two there, which is,
well,
I think, overlooked.
If we look at the map that you've got up, it very clearly shows us that the bulk of the armoured units were actually on the southern shoulder of that pocket, so facing the Americans. Whereas, of course, ironically, Monty was in the driving seat for shutting it off or closing off the pocket once he got to Falaise. The other thing is, of course, is that the Panzer divisions had to try and create this, perimeter, this crust, if you like, while the infantry divisions withdrew from the middle of it. Now, you could argue, actually, the Panzer divisions probably would have been better off as the spearhead, because your mobile units and your tanks, ultimately the vital bits. So with benefit of hindsight, which is always a dangerous thing, you could say, actually, the Germans could have sacrificed a lot of their infantry in favour of their armoured divisions by doing that round the other way, that the infantry would have maintained the perimeter while the armoured divisions cut their way out. And if they'd massed more tanks to to keep the pocket open, then the battle might have gone more badly for the Allies. The outcome would have been the same. The situation was such that the Germans were on their last legs. So I think, the Canadians and the Poles, they had a tough time. There's no getting around that. But it could have been even tougher. I'm always a bit skeptical with Allied air power claims about, how many tanks and armored vehicles they knocked out. Those rockets were point and shoot, so they weren't terribly accurate. I mean, the greatest thing they did, of course, was vehicle crews would have that dilemma of, if you're under air attack, do you ride it out or do you bail out? And a lot of the time they would bail out and quite often didn't go back to their vehicles. They just left them, as the Allies found afterwards when they examined the pocket. A lot of equipment had simply been abandoned, by their crews because they'd obviously felt they had a better chance of surviving on foot. This obviously is that famous photograph of German troops surrendering at Saint-Lambert. And I think this was taken on the 19th, if I'm right. So,
yeah, I think so.
That's actually the day that the Canadians took control of the village. Which is quite remarkable because you'd think that would be after the battle had taken place. So the Canadians clearly caught quite a few guys, when they first arrived. Again, I'm going from memory, but I think the figure is overall the Canadians captured about 2,000 men, which you go is good, but is not an awful lot when you consider what was escaping out the pocket. The casualties, I can't remember. Was it 300 dead, 500 wounded, something like that? But in the Canadians' defence, I mean, it's all right with us, the benefit of hindsight, but we weren't on the ground there with Curry. He had some difficult decisions to make. And also, quite frankly, his unit simply was not strong enough. I mean, what he achieved, I think, is quite remarkable. It wasn't until the arrival of some 17-pounder anti-tank guns that his position was a lot more secure. I mean, as we know, they were driven out the southern half of the village, and clung on to the north of it. Curry would have been in quite, in order to have gone, I'm losing guys too rapidly, we're going to withdraw from the ridge. So he could have actually pulled out and withdrawn back to Hill, 117. He could have done that, but actually they stayed put. His Victoria Cross, I mean, I think is well earned when you consider, they were sat right in the face of a tide of, Germans just desperate to get away, and on the whole did not surrender. I mean, they kept attacking the Canadians. It wasn't until 2021 that, when it was all over, that they started to surrender in bigger numbers, because obviously they knew they were not going to get out.
And I think the real point about when we've done shows on the Falaise Gap is that David Curry's big issue is, if he's standing on Hill 117, he can't see with the crossing points of the river. If he's near the church, he can't see the ford. If he's at the top part of town, he can't see the Hill 117 or the bridge. Wherever he is, he's only got part of the picture. And as you say, his force never kind of gets more than about a couple of hundred people at any one time, and a dozen or so Sherman tanks rotating these units in and out. And as often is the case, when we talk about from that Canadian point of view, we don't talk about the quality of some of the German units that are trying to get past him.
You've got famously
they're pretty organised.
Yeah, famously you've got Second Panzer, who were tough, highly combat experienced. Again, guys who knew what they were doing. I mean, poor old Curry and his men, they're effectively the Alamo. I mean, it's easy for us to go, oh, well, he could have done this, he could have done that. you go, effectively, they were in the Alamo with a stand fast order, which, as I say, they would have had every right to pull out. I mean, for them to stay there was for a lot of them was a death sentence. And they were lucky in that, of course, increasingly the Germans were running out of fuel for their tanks, spare parts. The Germans in the past were always a dab hand at retrieving Panzers. Their engineers and their mechanics were first class. But increasingly, of course, as we discussed earlier, what was attacking the Canadians and indeed the Poles were ad hoc battle groups, which kind of were all arms, but they'd have maybe a few anti-tank guns, maybe the odd 88mm, and maybe a handful of tanks. So you're not talking full Panzer battalion, you're not talking full Panzer regiment. These were quite weak units, but because they knew what to do, they knew how to get the best out of what they had to hand. Because in a way, Curry ironically played the Germans at their own game, because he effectively was in charge of a small battle group, that had to act flexibly, because he moved about that, as you say, moved around the village with the ebb and flow of the battle. So in a way, he was doing exactly what the Germans were doing to him, But as you're right, they'd company of infantry, I think, for a while. 15.
Sheldrake just made the point. I mean, at one point, there's only about 80 Argylls there. There's the tankers, because when the Shermans first move in, and Brad Sanquan knows this as well as anybody else. He's done shows on his channel about the Canadians. They have to dismount some of the tank crews to actually move through the village. They're that short of infantry, which is showing that they just haven't got enough men on the ground. And then later on, it gets worse as you're trying to cover these various positions there. Then the Lincoln and Wellens turn up. Thank you for reminding us at this later on. And I'm reference to the point that Brad makes there on this day in Canadian military history is the way Curry described it. The Germans were far from organized. Now that's an interesting point, because referencing what John Buckley said a couple of days ago about the development and of British and Canadian armored doctrine, there's a tendency sometimes to look at these improvised ad hoc groups through the Allied lens of being too small, too ineffective, and you've got a few of this and a few of that. But from the German point of view, and this is where your study has taken you, they can be, despite their lack of numbers, pretty effective, partly because they've had experience of doing this for several years, some of these units, and also because a small unit is maybe easier to control than a large unit. I think James Horn references that point about the freedom of poverty the Germans have compared to the restrictions of wealth the Allies have, in that the Allies have to take time to get all their stuff together, but these improvised battle groups can take advantage of a fluid situation perhaps better than a larger group. What's your feeling about that?
I think it's right. We have to be careful not to over glorify camp group, and it's an expression as military historians we all use. We do have to remember a lot of them were not any good whatsoever. They weren't all fighting, in a tough first-class manner. You would have had lots of Germans who had just simply gone, "I've had enough," throw down their weapons, and then, and leg it in the hope that they'd either be captured or that they would get through enemy lines and reach safety. So we need to be careful that we don't sort of over-glorify their achievements. And I think probably that remark about, from the Canadians' point of view, the German attacks didn't look well coordinated. Probably by that stage of the battle, they weren't. The other thing is, of course, is that the Germans didn't really have much flexibility in that they needed that bridge and they needed to get through the village. If they go north, they're going to run into more Canadian positions on that hill. They can go south over the ford, but that's not terribly vehicle friendly. They're also under an air attack and artillery attack down there. So the Germans didn't really have much option by this, as you rightly say, it's a 0.7 of a mile. They just have not got a large area to get through. So I suspect increasingly those attacks became more and more desperate. But some people, I'm going from memory, there was a colonel, I think it's Colonel Gerdsdorf, who organized a camp group who famously, got out of the pocket. Because, of course, soldiers need to be inspired by good leadership. I mean, we all know that. Backbone of every single army is good quality NCOs, but you also need good officers. If you've got a good collection of NCOs that are battle experienced and combat hardened and competent officers, then the guys will do as they're told because they have confidence that you're going to get them out of the pocket. If the officers just go, right, I'm saving my own neck and go, then you've got a shamble on your hands. So I think, I go back to my previous point. I think the German performance is testimony to, on the whole, their level of training and level of discipline, which is not to say they were all exactly the same across the board. And I say, again, we must treat these battle groups with caution, because they were not all, they're not all wonder units, if you like. A lot of them, of course, once they ran out of ammo or Panzerfausts, if you run out of anti-tank weapons, that's pretty much the end of the game. But I think we included the photos. There are a couple of shots, going back to the Canadians in the village. Of course, when they first got in there, the comment about the infantry is right. Those tanks rolled straight into an ambush effectively. German anti-tank guns or Panzerfaust guys lurking in the buildings. I mean, this is what greeted the Canadians. They lost a fair few Sherman tanks the minute they entered the village. And of course, that's reflective of the fact they did not have enough infantry to support the tanks. The infantry should have flushed out those guys beforehand, rather than let the tanks spearhead the attack. But again, that it's easy to be wise after the event. Curry didn't really have much choice.
Well, indeed, yeah, and David O'Keefe, Brad Sanquist, all the Canadians watching are debating Curry, and is it an advance to contact? Is it a fighting patrol? Is it an attempt to take the village on? I mean, it's still debated exactly what Curry's mission was all about. But I think one of the questions I want to ask, because I enjoy taking tours down to the Falaise Gap, and is we know that, for example, Curry has communicated with his artillery, he has communication back, he can refuel his tanks. What about the German communication between their units? Because again, I think a lot of the writing going back, this idea of everything in disarray, no one knows where they're going, it's just kind of following their noses out there. But from your investigation, your study in this, how much control have they the Germans, of their own units at this point, or is it just lots of just what they're reacting to what they can see physically on the battlefield around them?
Well, I think, obviously, because I wasn't there, but I think on the whole, pretty good, because again, you have to say, going back to my earlier remark about they didn't capture many generals, most of the core level units that were in that pocket, well, not most, all of them got out. So they did not capture any of the core level structures, obviously, with their radio operators, their staff officers, and their generals. So it means probably at a core level, command and control still existed to a certain degree amongst those core and the divisions they're responsible. Now, I suspect further up the food chain you went, it became more and more chaotic. And also, I suspect in the pocket, increasingly, they would have relied on runners, the old Wellington method of you have runners, dispatch riders to keep in touch, because increasingly, of course, their radio vans will get knocked out, or they'd break down, or, they'd run over mines or whatever. So increasingly, they would be cut off from each other in terms of radio communication. Yeah, this is General Elfelden, is it, or Elfeld? I'm going from memory here. Elfeld.
Yeah, that's it.
Elfeld. Yeah, commander of 84th Corps. So he was Corps. But to the best of my knowledge, and I'm going from memory here, is the rest of them got out, which means that core level, as we know, you've kind of got, you have your regiments, your division, your corps, which typically controls 2 or more divisions, and then you've got your army made up of your corps. That's your command and control structure. Those corps still functions reasonably well in the pockets and got out, because again, it's that level of command and control that enabled the Germans to gather up all their scattered Panzer units once they were the other side of the Seine, and quickly get them shipped back off to Germany or wherever they needed to go to refit. So there's clearly, again, going back to my point, the discipline was pretty good in the pocket, but I think there was a level of command and control was maintained, because again, once a unit was cut off, lost, and not given orders, the chances are that they're going to surrender. There's nothing else that they can do effectively. So I think that level of command and control was pretty good. Again, which is not to say it wasn't chaotic around air attack, artillery attack, and all the rest of it. So the situation would have been quite dire. But I think, on the whole, the generals did not lose their heads. There was no massed panic. And again, I read accounts of you'd get majors and colonels. They'd find disparate groups of men. They would round them up. You know, the guys are then grateful that they've got an officer, you know, that at least is going to lead them somewhere, and off they go. So it's kind of this sort of constant ad hoc, you know, keep everything moving, keep everyone moving eastwards all the time.
And I think, you know, we'll touch on now the aftermath, because, you know, that we're now on the 26th of August now. So in this period, 78 years ago, 4 days after Gap had closed, there's kind of two ways of looking at things, because obviously these two forces had met in this ridiculously tiny battlefield as it reduces to at the end. You know, every army is there represented: Polish, American, British, Canadian, everybody's there.
Yeah.
And then you have the aftermath, and you included the photo of there's Eisenhower walking through there, and Eisenhower makes that statement. Falaise is undoubtedly one of the most incredible killing grounds of the war, and as I was conducted through it on foot. It was scenes that only Dante could have described. I think I'm paraphrasing the quote. One could have stepped for yards without anything but stepping on human flesh. And you get all these accounts of these Allied journalists and people like that who've been. Dirk Bogarde was there, famously kind of walking through it. You know, then became the famous actor. And there's this destruction, the scenes of destruction. We've all seen the photos. If you go to Montormel as a visitor today, the staff there tell you about the cloud of black flies over the valley for the next years and years, and the water table destroyed. And that, of course, all that's true. But the Germans who've escaped, these tens of thousands of Germans who got out, albeit without their vehicles, they're forging out a different kind of history. They're not dwelling on this. It's the Allies who are walking through the pocket. So what you know, talking about Rouen, talking about falling back now. How are the Germans who've got out, these generals who haven't been captured, are they coming out with their morale shot to pieces, or are they ready for another fight?
Well, I would backtrack a minute there and go back to your remarks about the apocryphal battlefield. I remember reading, claims by Allied fighter bomber pilots claiming they could smell it in the air, which is quite remarkable. But I think the thing to remember with Falaise, because it was a small area, obviously the death and destruction looked that much worse, you know, because you're not looking at scattered fields with bodies, you're looking at roads and lanes and bridges, you know, where the corpses are piled up. But the thing to remember is, you know, and we all come across this, no one can ever agree on numbers and quite often dates. You know, as a historian, it drives me spare, because essentially you have to pump for one or some sort of happy, you know, middle ground. But, you know, essentially they claim about 10,000 Germans died in the pocket. You go, that's an awful lot of soldiers. But actually, when you look at it, you go, that's a weak division. So that's not actually a lot, you know, in pure military terms. Obviously, in human terms, that's an appalling cost. And that when the pocket was closed off, the Allies captured about 50,000 Germans. And you go, well, that's quite a lot, isn't it? But you go, well, again, that's about 5 weak divisions. So that's when you think of the sheer number of divisions that the Germans committed to Normandy, that's actually not very many. But to go back to your question, obviously, those that survived, you know, famously, we have General Erbach, who, was caught by the Allies by surprise. He was trying to oversee withdrawal of 7th Army and got caught. But I was always fascinated by one of the much maligned Luftwaffe field divisions. Forgive me, I can't remember what number it is. But, Göring famously refused to give up manpower to the German army. So created all these almost completely useless Luftwaffe field divisions, about 30 of them. Most of them fought on the Eastern Front, but some of them were committed in Normandy. But one of them, you know, wedged itself in that bend in the River Seine, is it Elbeuf, I think, just below Rouen. And they dug their heels in, dug their guns in, and they kept that crossing open for as long as they could. So again, it's a level of, you know, discipline. Also, from a unit that's not really terribly great, you know, it's the Luftwaffe field division. It's got ancient artillery, probably some 88 millimeters, but on the whole, not a lot of good equipment. But they dug their heels in there and enabled guys to get across the river. I think they built, you know, some pontoons and what have you, because all the bridges were down. But they still maintained that bridgehead there. Someone's just flashed up.
Of course, it's Niels. Yeah. Niels, who
General Hocker, I think. Niels, is it 17th Luftwaffe Field Division? Yeah, I think it's General Hocker, who again, you know, his performance is quite surprising. Now, obviously, he was reinforced by certain elements of the Panzer divisions as well, which beefed up his defence. But you know, again, you would have expected them to panic and just flee over the river, and that would be the end of it. But again, they stood their ground for quite a while and enabled a lot of guys to get over the river, you know, and carry on withdrawing. Because obviously, the next defensive line was the Somme, which they thought they were gonna, you know, use, but they kept going pretty much till they got to the Netherlands. But that's another story. But you know, as I said earlier, I always think that the German rearguard at Rouen is one of those sort of unsung episodes of the entire campaign, because of course everyone gets preoccupied with Paris, you know, and Free French armoured, you know, disobeying orders. Who can blame them? Because they wanted to liberate their capital. But everyone kind of gets, you know, you know, what's happening north of Paris. No one's really interested, and of course everyone's a bit more interested in the fate of General von Choltitz and his, you know, his forlorn garrison in Paris and the decision to declare it open city and all this and the other. And also, of course, with First French, there's all that romance, you know, of them flying pell-mell to Paris and driving in and, you know, drinking in every village and hamlet that they stopped off in. Yeah, you're flashing up some. I mean, that's the docks in Rouen. So again, it shows you the level of equipment that avoided being trapped in the pocket. I mean, we're looking at 88mm flat guns there and their prime movers. So, you know, they were obviously either set fire to by their crews because they couldn't get them over the river, or, you know, Allied bombers caught them, you know, because the docks were bombed quite extensively on a regular basis. I'm going from memory. I think, I mean, the Germans left thousands of vehicles at the docks, so something like 3,000. So again, gives you a level of equipment that they almost got away with. That in part and parcel, of course, is testimony to the effectiveness of Operation Point Blank in the efforts to cut, you know, the Germans off in Normandy by taking out most of the bridges over the major French rivers to stop them, you know, shipping reinforcements either west or north from the south of France.
And just to remind folks, we did a show with Michael J. Stout a few weeks ago about the Luftwaffe field division. So go back and find that, and I'll put the link into the description afterwards. That's worth talking about. And David O'Keefe has come up with a really good talking point to move on to next. And David O'Keefe can always be relied on for a great talking point. He's saying,
thank you,
so
David.
To rip a page from British Dunkirk propaganda, I guess the Germans could consider this the miracle of Falaise. And that's reversing the whole story the other way, in that it, you know, going back this idea about how complete was the victory. In if you want to sell it that way, you could sell it as a pretty well organized fallback that really only comes a cropper, as you said there, their inability to cross the river at Rouen, which is another chapter. It's another story. So what's your reaction to David's comment?
No, David's perfectly right, because the Germans, I think, was it Model or someone, I can't remember who it was, but somebody famously called it the miracle in the West. You know, by September 44, in the West, the Germans have got 100 Panzers. You know, the massed armored forces the Allies have got, it should have been end of game, but actually it wasn't. You know, they managed to retrieve a fair amount of their manpower. They quickly managed to stabilize the front because, of course, you know, famously within a matter of 3 weeks, is it? You've got Arnhem, you know, and the Germans brought the Allies to a sharpish halt, you know, with Operation Market Garden. So again, that's almost, you know, I was referencing Battle of the Bulge earlier, saying, you know, the outcome of the failure at Falaise is Battle of the Bulge. Well, you could almost say actually the failure to catch those Panzer divisions meant, you know, 9th and 10th are recuperating in the Arnhem area and gave Market Garden a bloody nose. So it you know, within 3 weeks of the entire German front on the Western Front collapsing, they've solidified it. Now, to be fair to the Allies, at the end of their supply lines, you know, we all know, even when we got our hands on Antwerp, we couldn't use it. Cherbourg and almost the Cherbourg's in, you know, ruins. Most of the Channel ports are still in German hands. So the Allies had this real major resupply problem. You've got half a dozen armies across the width of Western Europe that you're trying to supply. So to be fair to the Allies, they were kind of grinding to a halt a bit. But the very fact that the Germans just never gave up. As Jeff rightly says, you know, the Germans pulled out the stops for their tank production, which again shows you how not ineffective, but lacking focus the Allied Strategic Bomber Command air offensive was. You know, because by the end of the war, the Germans were producing more armored equipment than they had crews for. You know, in fact, the bigger problem the Germans had was not manufacturing stuff; it was getting it from the factories to the frontline units, because obviously the Allies were attacking the railway lines, and that caused problems. Because that was one of the handicaps of the Battle of the Bulge, was that, you know, the Allies kept attacking that railhead at Cologne, which greatly slowed down, you know, supplies and equipment being shipped forward to you know, the armies involved in that operation. So yeah, go back to my point. It kind of, the irony is with the point blank operations and the strategic bomber air offensive, the thing that the Germans were running out of was fuel. I mean, that was the thing that was getting critical, like late 44. You know, it's affecting the army and the Luftwaffe because they were rapidly running out of fuel. And that in part, of course, was the success of attacking their synthetic oil plants, because obviously the sources of natural oil were beginning to run out in Eastern Europe. But I mean, it's just remarkable that they re-equipped, you know, 7 entire Panzer divisions from scratch from October onwards, around to December when they launched that offensive. So, you know, going back to my point with the book, you know, that was the fundamental flaw in Falaise, is that regeneration of those, not only regeneration of a Panzer army, but also, you know, 5th Panzer Army. They created a new one with the 6th Panzer Army, you know, which again is quite remarkable.
To the key personnel they got out. I mean, if the tables had been reversed, and if the Germans had half their generals captured in the Falaise Gap, what would have happened to the British and the Canadians if, for example, in the end of July, we had lost some of our, you know, Bucknell and Horrocks and Middleton, and, you know, we'd suddenly lost 70% of our generals and brigadiers in one fell swoop? That would have been, I wouldn't have said it been maybe a disaster, but it would have certainly thrown a spanner in the works. And the fact is, the Germans did get the majority of their divisional commanders out. They did get this core cadre of people who knew what they were doing. And as we said there, tank production is increasing in those last few months there. And I forget who I was talking to at We Have Ways Fest. It might have been Sol David or someone else, about how often us, you know, British English-speaking historians, we talk about the Falaise Gap as being the final battle of the Normandy campaign. From the German point of view, you could call it the first battle of the defense of Germany campaign, as you said there, leading then to Market Garden, which obviously they didn't know about. That was their reaction to our plan, but it's a first chapter for them of a different type of action, as it is equally to us, the Allies, the closing of one action.
Yeah, I mean, I really like David O'Keefe's analogy that effectively Falaise was a German Dunkirk. So was Rouen, to be fair. You know, that, and also, of course, we forget, of course, in the south, Army Group G escaped pretty much intact.
Yeah.
You know, General Blaskowitz down there did a remarkable job in getting nearly all of his divisions away. You know, they lost the garrisons in Marseille and Toulon, but then that was simply because Hitler wouldn't let them withdraw. But pretty much the rest of Army Group G escaped to fight another day. You know, so that we kind of see Dragoon and Overlord as these sort of, you know, decisive strategic strokes, whereas actually they put the Allies on a slow road to victory, really. I'm firmly of the view that Dragoon was a waste of time, quite frankly. I mean, I think Churchill was right that it did prove to be a nugatory exercise. I think they would have been better off actually committing the troops to the Normandy campaign. As we know, Churchill obviously wanted them kept in Italy because he had this bee in his bonnet that we could break through there, whereas clearly by mid-1944 that wasn't going to happen. You know, the only way we won there was simply by fighting the Germans to a standstill. I mean, you know, by the time they'd surrendered, they're on the last legs in Italy. But those Dragoon and Overlord, they're not as, you know, decisive as everyone thinks they are. And you're right, you know, for us as historians, Falaise is a nice bookend to the Normandy campaign, whereas of course, really for the Allies and indeed the Germans, they didn't see it like that because the war kept going. You know, the fighting continued. They just moved on to the next action. You know, if you're the man on the ground or a general on the ground, actually, it was more of the same until such time as Berlin was taken.
I mean, yeah, thank you for that. And as you know, the rabbit holes are opening up. Alexander Fitzgerald Black is saying if they had shoved more troops than normally, was there, you know, would that where would they have put them? Another logistical problem there. But to bring things to an end from the German point of view, you know, what are the other things that we think perhaps are overlooked when we're studying the Falaise Gap as a campaign, a battle, whatever you want to call it? You know, again, the focus often is what the Canadians are doing. Often, to my annoyance, the focus is what Bradley and Montgomery and the generals are doing rather than at the kind of a lower level. What other are there any other key aspects of the German decision-making or German movements or German actions that you think should always be considered when we're talking about the Falaise area?
Well, I think the thing to remember is the point I made earlier, of course, is not all the German units were in that pocket. You know,
yeah.
we showed that nice map, and it's kind of convenient to think, you know, Falaise pocket, end of the German war effort. But actually, there were lots of units outside that pocket. I mean, I as I said, you know, when we started, I think the fundamental mistake that Hitler made, because his generals didn't want to do it, was that Mortain counterattack to try and cut off Patton's breakthrough at Avranches. If they'd started a week earlier, they might have got even more troops and equipment out. The other thing is, of course, is for the Germans, they were slightly lucky that the Americans didn't start pushing north from Argentan, you know, and that we didn't cut our way south from Falaise, because maybe, you know, we're now into the realms of what if we could have cut the pocket off sooner. But I think for the Germans, the fundamental problem was they should have acted sooner. You know, that was the real problem they always had. But of course, Hitler's mantra was continually don't give up ground. I mean, that, you know, he constantly strangled his general strategic initiative indeed tactical initiative, by constantly refusing to let them give up ground, which of course is an anathema for mobile warfare. You know, if you give up some ground, you can come back. If you stay put, you know, the enemy takes the initiative. And in many ways, that was a constant problem the Germans faced increasingly on the Western and on the Eastern fronts, and indeed in Italy, that they, you know, they conquered a big chunk of Europe using blitzkrieg because it was all about mobility, flexibility, combined arms warfare. And increasingly, the Allies learned how to do that, and the Germans kind of gave up on it, simply because Hitler always felt that he knew best, you know. And, you know, going back to the earlier point about one of the reasons that the Germans maybe were not as vexed about being trapped in that pocket as we might have expected them to be, was because they'd had so much experience on the Eastern Front of being in those sorts of similar jams and being able to extricate themselves. But of course, the problem that they had, again, is something we didn't touch on, was of course the weakness of the Luftwaffe on the Western Front. I mean, that, you know, it singularly failed to keep Allied fighter bombers off the ground forces. You know, as we know, the German Panzer units and indeed the infantry divisions were armed to the teeth with flak guns, but they could only do so much. You really needed regular aircraft in the air. And of course, the Luftwaffe's performance during the Normandy campaign was pretty sporadic, to say the least. Yeah, well, certainly by the time we get to the Falaise Gap. And that brings us back to the idea of the photos we have of the destruction, because, of course, you know, your Typhoon, taxi ranks of Typhoons are doing their work there, but they're doing their work primarily on the rear of the columns, the slow moving, the soft skins, the wagons, things like that. And they can't use their air power right. I mean, in Saint-Lambert, if Curry had called upon air power right there, he'd have had blue on blue instance. So the firepower by the air power is bringing it sometime back in the forest there. So that's a bit of red herring. But my kind of Sorry, I was just going to say, I think one of those fallacies again about the success of air power over the pocket is we need to bear in mind that they were probably quite often destroying stuff already destroyed. Or
they're destroying the same vehicle that had already been destroyed.
That constant counting this. It's, you know, fighter pilots were notorious for claiming they'd shot down so many aircraft. I mean, it's the same. It's, unless you've got gun footage, it's very difficult to determine what you've destroyed on the ground unless it's moving and it's stopped. And then you know how. But you know, if you attack a column of vehicles and all the guys are bailed out, well, you don't know whether they've already been shot up, whether they've broken down, whether the crews have abandoned them, whether indeed the crews have set fire to them, because of course they'd regularly, you know, douse their vehicles in petrol to stop them falling into Allied hands. So there's that constant thing of you it's almost impossible to gauge what the level of destruction was that was inflicted by Allied air power. And also, to go back to your good point about, they were effectively bombing the tail end of everything. You can only call in, air support where you've got a ground liaison officer. And again, it goes back to your point about, for that, you need good visibility.
Yeah.
There's that famous photo, isn't there, of Canadian soldiers crouched by a roadside, and there's airstrikes or artillery fire in the distance and all the smoke billowing up. And you go, well, those guys on the ground there have got no idea what's going on up the road because they don't know what's being hit. Now, there may be a forward controller further up the road or an artillery spotter, or they're just shooting, hopefully, in the general direction of, some coordinates they've been given. So it although the cab rank system worked quite well, it was quite hit and miss. And again, wasn't all seeing. That's the other thing to remember is we have all these apocryphal stories of Typhoons and Mustangs and Thunderbolts swooping out the air and shooting up everything that moved. Well, they could only do that where they were actually vectored in onto a target.
Yeah, and if you read the accounts of some of the Germans there, it's often the artillery they talk about as doing the damage, as it all often is. It's the boring old artillery. I mean, I love artillery, but I think it's the artillery doing a lot of damage.
The god of war, yes.
Yeah, but I mean, the other thing, and that you mentioned it there, is just that the confusion of everything is that us historians now, we can look at it and say, Second Panzer's there, so and so is there, this unit is there, this regiment, the 90th Division is doing this there. For most of the people involved in that very fraught combat from the 19th to the 22nd, they don't know exactly which unit are facing them. They don't know where their own, so it's all very easy in a sense for us now with 78 years to say, oh, there's a bit of a portion of blame there. That could have been done a bit better. They should move there. And that my last question is going to be, really, does it matter that we're still debating this? And some people are saying it's I stood in the Falaise Gap with Max Hastings years ago, and he was completely of the opinion that it was a flawed victory. It was a victory, but it wasn't the slam dunk it could have been. But then, that's what we've also discussed today from the German point of view. They could have done more as well. It wasn't a slam dunk organized retreat either. It was does it matter that we don't have a firm conclusion? Is that actually better for history that we keep on debating it?
Yeah, no, I think that's partly what makes it a stimulating intellectual challenge is poring over what happened. And the other thing, of course, as historians is you have to be careful with the accepted narrative, which is not to say it's wrong, but you do need to think of looking at other ways that the story was spun, because otherwise that story becomes so ingrained, we take it as read, whereas actually you go, well, like you've just said, with all the maps that we've put up, well, they've been done with hindsight. They're purely representative. There's no way of saying that's accurate. That's a rough approximation of where those units were. And like you've just said, for the Germans on the ground, they had no idea where they were. All they knew was that they were fleeing east and heading for the river because that's what they had to do. Some of them would have maps, some of them would have radios. But so that sort of, again, that graphic representation and that sort of visual image that we have of the campaign needs to be treated with a certain degree of, caution, if you like. And I think the thing that makes it interesting is that there are so many what ifs. I mean, that's, part of the fun that we've had is what could they have done differently? And also importantly for things like staff colleges, it's what lessons can we draw from that, because despite advances in technology, the general experience of warfare remains universal, as does the requirements of leadership and problem solving. I was reading the comment.
The kind of that static late June, early July period where there can be almost days with nothing happening except patrolling. The speed with which this battle takes shape and units move into this arena of combat that no one was really expecting to be where the arena of combat was going to be. No one had kind of anticipated back in June. I think it'll all end up in a little bridge in a little village called Saint-Lambert, on that little road that goes. That would have been beyond anybody's imagination. No. The fact that these people are adapting and reacting to a situation that is changing by World War II standards incredibly fast. It's easy to be critical of decisions made, but if you were there on the ground, it would have been a very I mean, David Curry, I think you said it yourself, a deserved Victoria Cross, despite the fact we can say, why didn't he just blow up the bridge? Why didn't he get more people? You know, there's lots of whys you can still ask, but still acknowledge that he did a fantastic job.
Yeah, and I mean, it's very easy to criticize. And the other thing, you know, it goes back to my point about, you know, we're reliant on accounts, you know, if we're lucky, first-hand accounts, memoirs, divisional histories. We're reliant on all that, you know, as historians, to paint a picture for us. And there's a certain degree of truth in that, but we weren't there, so we don't know for definite if our perspective of what happened is correct. I think that for David, I mean, David Curry, you know, what he and his men achieved is quite remarkable, I think, because with all of the Normandy campaign, I think the thing to remember is essentially that the generals on both sides were making it up as they went along. You know, we like to think that there was some sort of master plan.
Yeah.
But essentially warfare is action reaction all the time. You know, if you're doing the action, you've got the initiative, and if you're doing the reaction, you're on the defensive. And that's effectively what happened in Normandy. And I think one of the reasons that Falaise has become so famous is, over and above the horrific destruction that occurred there, was the fact that for the Allies, the Normandy campaign was such a dreadful long slog and a hard-won victory, you know, because you think Epsom, Goodwood, Cobra, the American battle through the Bocage North, you know, because again, we forget, because the Americans were suffering from manpower shortages by the time they cleared the Cotentin Peninsula and got to Cherbourg. You know, the Americans and us, you know, because we all say, oh, Monty was a cautious general because he was trying to preserve his manpower. Well, the Americans went through the grinder as well. That, you know, we need to remember that they were physically short of men by the time they'd finished it, because they'd shed so much blood to take something which essentially didn't really have much strategic value. I mean, again,
I'm with you on that. I think the Cherbourg debacle, you know, was a complete red herring. I think the effort and expenditure of sending 7 divisions, where it was one corps and a few independent divisions up towards Cherbourg for a harbour they ended up not being able to use was
no, and they should have foreseen that. I mean, you know, I did a book for the 75th anniversary of D-Day, and one of my focuses was you know, all the scientific problem solving that went on. I mean, as we both know, planning for D-Day was absolutely incredible. You know, if you could think of a problem, they came up with a solution. You know, with the mulberries and swimming tanks and all that kind of stuff, and you know, 79th Armoured Division with the you know, hobos, funnies, all that sort of stuff, and the airborne operations. And then you go, at which bit of taking Cherbourg did it not occur to you that the Germans will systematically wreck the docks? They will do everything in their power to ensure you cannot use the harbour. You know, because we, you know, I'm sure David O'Keefe will chime in on this one, but you know, with Dieppe, the one thing it taught us was we don't want to capture a port. That's simply too difficult. Ergo, we went for the mulberries, and in fact, of course, the verdict's out on them, because the Americans ended up landing just as much equipment over open beaches as we did on the Armoured mulberry. But we'd done all that problem solving. So why we didn't build some sort of super harbour? Because again, you would have gone, well, if we can't get them out of Dieppe or Boulogne, you know, all the French Channel ports, we can't get them out. What are we going to do? They seem to, again, they underestimated the Germans' ability to resist. That, you know, once they're holed up there, then it's like medieval siege warfare. We'll batter them into submission. Well, no, a lot of them stay put. I mean, it's like the Breton ports. You know, they didn't give up until the end of the war, did they?
Yeah.
Which is what
we've fallen down some severe rabbit holes now, which we knew we would do. I think we will bring that thing to an end, but I want to acknowledge again Alexander Black's fantastic statement there. Monty's master plan was to convince us all he had a master plan. Yeah. If that's your own quote, Alex, then that should be the title of your next book, Alex, because that's it. So. Yeah, very, very.
The history of war is written by the victors, isn't it? That's always the case. It is indeed.
Yeah. So I mean, and David O'Keefe hasn't quite reacted to he just said, "Don't get me started about Dieppe." So I've done 3 shows with Dieppe about David about Dieppe. So I think, quite frankly, we could do another one at some point. But no, we will bring things to an end.
I bow down to his expert knowledge on that campaign. Thank you.
And Alex is saying he did think that one up. So that's a toast to Alex for that. But yeah, it's an interesting discussion. The fact it's still open for more interpretation is all for the good there. So so going back to, you got a new book out now. You were in Crete. Is Crete on the horizon for a new book in the future?
Well, yes, early days yet, but my publisher was quite warm to the idea. As you know, I did a book. I've done a couple of books from German perspectives, not just the Normandy one. I did an Arnhem one, and I've done a Battle of the Bulge one. So again, I'm fascinated by Crete. Again, it's a bit like Normandy. Of all the things that went wrong, again, the Germans didn't deserve to win there. So yes, maybe.
Okay.
We'll see how that. I'll keep you posted on that.
Keep you posted. We'll have you back for discussion about that at some point. So I'm just going to take you off screen for a second and bring you back in to say goodbye. But folks, I'm off this weekend, having a bit of a break, watching some football tomorrow. But Monday, a couple of absolute stonkingly good shows about Operation Barbarossa. If you've ever been to the operationbarbarossa.net site run by Nigel Askey, well, he's coming on to talk about some of the Soviet losses. So for those who like graphs, charts, and data, these are going to be the two shows for you. We've got Prit Buttar on Monday talking about his latest book, and Wendy Goldman is joining me later in the week to talk about the Soviet civilian front, the Red Army, and the civilians in Soviet Union, and the pulling back of all their factories to the east to keep on churning out stuff. That'll be fascinating. And then some other shows I'm still working on scheduling. So watch your YouTube listings for that, because the two shows with Nigel Askey will be on in the morning UK time because he's in Australia. So check the timings of that. But I'm going to bring Anthony back in to say good evening. It was a really fantastic chat, and we stumbled into a few rabbit holes, but we got out before being lost.
I'm conscious I'm sat in the dark now. It was lovely and sunny outside my window.
It seemed we have blown past for 75 minutes. It was blown past in about 5 minutes, but we'll bring you back for something in the future. But brilliant. So thanks everybody for watching. This is Paul Woodadge and Anthony Tucker-Jones saying thank you for your company. I will see you all again. Cheers, everybody. Bye.